The evening had been designed to feel like a return to something simpler, something safer, a rare moment when the weight of legacy and rivalry could be set aside in favor of warmth and familiarity. And as the Forrester mansion filled with soft music, golden light, and the low hum of conversation, it almost succeeded in creating that illusion. Laughter drifted across the room, mingling with the quiet clink of glasses and the subtle undercurrent of affection that only a family bound by both love and history could produce. And for a fleeting stretch of time, it seemed as though the fractures that had long defined them had finally receded into the background. Faces softened, voices lowered, and even the most guarded among them allowed themselves to relax, if only slightly, as though the night itself had offered a fragile promise that not everything had to be a battle. At the center of that warmth stood RJ, his posture lighter than it had been in weeks, his gaze repeatedly finding its way back to Electra with a quiet, almost disbelieving happiness that spoke of something still new, still delicate, still untested by the harsher realities of the world they lived in. There was a softness in the way he looked at her, a sense of possibility that had not yet been touched by doubt, and in return, Electra met that gaze with something equally tender, though perhaps less certain, as if part of her was already bracing for something she could not yet fully articulate. Their closeness drew subtle attention, not because it was inappropriate, but because it was sincere, and sincerity, in a family like this, was both rare and dangerously exposed. They spoke quietly at first, their voices blending into the surrounding noise, but the intimacy of their exchange was unmistakable. Plans began to take shape between them, not as firm decisions, but as dreams spoken aloud, tentative yet hopeful, sketches of a future that felt within reach. There was something almost disarming about the way they imagined what could be, as though the past held no power over them, as though they existed in a space untouched by the secrets that had long defined the Forrester name. It was a moment of innocence, fragile and fleeting, and perhaps that was what made what followed feel so devastatingly inevitable. Because even as RJ spoke of tomorrow, Electra's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around the envelope she held, the edges of it pressing into her palm, as if grounding her in a reality she could no longer delay. She had tried to ignore it, to postpone the moment, to allow herself just a little more time inside the illusion of normalcy, but the weight of what she carried refused to be dismissed. It pulsed beneath the surface of every word she spoke, every smile she forced, every glance she shared, until it became impossible to separate the present from what she knew was coming. There was a shift in her demeanor that did not go unnoticed. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation in her responses, a flicker of distraction that interrupted the rhythm of her interaction with RJ, but as the seconds passed, it grew more pronounced. Her gaze faltered, her posture stiffened, and the warmth that had defined her presence began to give way to something colder, something far more uncertain. RJ sensed it before he understood it, his expression tightening with concern as he tried to draw her back into the moment, unaware that the moment itself was already slipping beyond reach. The room, still filled with conversation, had not yet registered the change, but it was coming, gathering momentum in the silence that Electra carried within her, building toward a point where it could no longer be contained. And when it finally broke, it did so with a clarity that cut through everything else. She did not raise her voice. She did not seek attention, but the words she spoke were enough. The envelope trembled slightly in her hand as she revealed what it contained, the truth unfolding not as a dramatic declaration, but as something far more devastating, quiet, undeniable, irreversible. The DNA results were not ambiguous. They did not leave room for interpretation or doubt. They presented a reality that none of them had anticipated, a connection that should never have existed, a truth that rewrote everything that had come before it. RJ and Electra were not just connected by affection. They were bound by blood. The name that followed, Thorn, did not just add context. It detonated the moment entirely. For a second, the room seemed to lose its sound. Conversations faltered, laughter died mid-breath, and what remained was a silence, so complete it felt unnatural, as though the world itself had paused to absorb what had just been said. Faces turned, expressions shifting from curiosity to confusion, then to something far more profound as the implications began to take shape. RJ did not react immediately. The words reached him, but they did not settle, did not anchor themselves in understanding. His mind resisted them, pushing back against a reality that made no sense, that contradicted everything he had believed, everything he had felt. He looked at Electra, searching for something, clarification, denial, anything that might undo what had just been revealed, but what he found instead was confirmation. Not in her words, but in her eyes, in the way she held his gaze with a mixture of sorrow and resignation that left no room for hope. And in that moment, something inside him broke. It was not loud. It was not visible in the way others might expect, but it was absolute. The future they had imagined, the connection they had built, the trust that had grown between them, all of it collapsed under the weight of a truth that could not be reconciled with what they had shared. It did not matter that they had not known. It did not matter that their feelings had been genuine. The reality of their blood connection erased everything else, leaving behind only the echo of what had been, and the unbearable knowledge of what it had meant. Electra's composure faltered as she watched that realization take hold, her own grief mirroring his in a way that made the distance between them feel even more pronounced. She had carried this truth alone for too long, had struggled with it in silence, had tried to find a way to soften its impact, but there was no way to make it less devastating. There was only the moment of revelation, and the aftermath that followed. Around them, the room erupted, not in chaos at first, but in a wave of reactions that clashed and collided, each one shaped by shock, by disbelief, by the sudden unraveling of something that had seemed so certain just moments before. Voices rose, questions overlapped, and the fragile unity that had defined the evening shattered under the strain of a truth that refused to be contained. Will's reaction cut through the noise with a sharpness that was impossible to ignore. His disgust was not subtle, not tempered, but immediate and visceral, directed not just at the situation, but at the secret that had allowed it to happen in the first place. To him, this was not just a revelation. It was a violation, a failure of responsibility so profound that it demanded acknowledgement, demanded accountability. The fact that such a truth had been hidden, buried beneath years of silence, transformed the moment from tragedy into something far more infuriating. And that anger found its target quickly, because secrets like this do not exist in isolation. They are kept, protected, chosen. Eyes turned, accusations formed, and the unspoken question hung heavily in the air. Who had known? Brooke and Ridge stepped forward, their instincts guiding them toward containment, toward damage control, toward any action that might prevent the situation from spiraling further out of control. They spoke with calm where they could, with authority where it was needed, trying to anchor the moment before it fractured completely, but even as they did, it became clear that this was not something that could be smoothed over or explained away. Because the damage was not just external. It was internal. Trust had been broken, not just between individuals, but within the very foundation of the family itself. The idea that something so significant had been hidden for so long created a ripple effect that extended beyond RJ and Electra, beyond their relationship, into every connection that relied on honesty, on transparency, on the belief that family meant truth. That belief no longer felt secure. RJ stepped back, the distance he created physical, but also symbolic, a separation from everything that had just been taken from him. He did not look at Electra again, not because he did not care, but because looking at her now meant confronting a reality he was not ready to face. His expression hardened, not with anger, but with something more final, acceptance of loss. Electra remained where she was, the envelope still in her hand, though it no longer held the same significance. The truth had been spoken. It could not be returned, could not be reshaped, could not be undone. All that remained was the aftermath, the consequences that would ripple outward long after the moment itself had passed. The room, once filled with warmth, now felt fractured, each person standing within their own version of the same shock, their reactions shaped by their own histories, their own expectations, their own thresholds for betrayal. Some tried to make sense of it, to find logic where none existed. Others simply absorbed it, allowing the weight of it to settle without resistance. And beneath it all, there was a quiet, unsettling realization. This had not happened by accident, because truths like this do not simply surface. They are revealed. Elsewhere, far removed from the emotional wreckage left behind at the mansion, a phone screen lit up in the dimness of a secluded room. A message appeared, simple and precise, carrying no emotion, no explanation, only confirmation. It had worked. The figure holding the phone did not react dramatically. There was no visible celebration, no overt satisfaction. Only a subtle shift in posture, a slight easing of tension, as though something long anticipated had finally come to pass. The plan had not required force. It had not required confrontation. It had only required timing. And now, the result was undeniable. Back at the mansion, the echoes of the revelation continued to reverberate, shaping every interaction, redefining every relationship, leaving behind a silence that no amount of words could fill. Because some truths do not just change the present, they rewrite the past. And once that happens, there is no going back. The silence that followed the revelation did not settle into acceptance. It fractured into something far more dangerous, something that pulsed beneath the surface of every breath taken in that room. No one moved at first, as if motion itself might make the truth more real, more permanent, more impossible to deny. But reality does not wait for readiness, and slowly, inevitably, the emotional weight began to press outward, forcing reactions that could no longer be contained. RJ was the first to step away, though the movement felt less like a choice and more like a reflex, an instinctive attempt to create distance between himself and a truth that had rewritten his identity in an instant. His footsteps were unsteady, not physically, but emotionally, each step carrying the burden of something he had not yet fully processed. He did not look back. He could not. Because to look back would mean confronting Electra again, and that meant confronting the loss of everything they had just shared only moments ago. His mind tried to cling to fragments of the past, every smile, every promise, every quiet moment that had felt so genuine, but those memories were now contaminated by a truth that made them unbearable to hold on to. Electra watched him go, her body frozen in place, as if any movement might shatter what little composure she had left. The room blurred around her, voices rising and falling in distorted waves, but none of it reached her with clarity. All she could see was RJ's retreating figure. All she could feel was the hollow space left behind where hope had once existed. She had imagined this moment countless times, had feared it, had rehearsed how she might say the words, how she might soften the impact, but nothing could have prepared her for the reality of it. There was no gentle way to reveal a truth like this. There was only devastation. Will's voice cut through the room again, sharper now, more focused, no longer just reacting but demanding answers. His anger had evolved into something more pointed, something that sought direction, accountability, a target for the outrage that had taken hold of him. He spoke of betrayal, not just between RJ and Electra, but within the entire family structure, his words carrying the weight of someone who refused to accept that such a secret could exist without intention, without complicity. His disgust was not subtle, and it did not fade. It lingered, thick in the air, amplifying the tension that had already begun to spiral. Brooke tried to intervene, her voice calm but strained, urging restraint, urging understanding, urging everyone to step back from the edge they were all rapidly approaching. But even as she spoke, it became clear that logic had little place in this moment. This was not a situation that could be reasoned through or resolved with careful words. This was emotional fallout, raw and immediate, and it demanded to be felt before it could ever be processed. Ridge stood beside her, his expression more controlled, but no less shaken. There was a rigidity in his posture, a tension in his jaw that betrayed the internal storm he was struggling to contain. He understood the implications of what had been revealed, not just on a personal level, but on a generational one.
This was not just about RJ.
It was about the integrity of the family itself, about the hidden truths that had been allowed to exist unchecked, about the consequences of silence. And then there was the question that none of them could avoid any longer. Who knew? It did not need to be spoken aloud for it to take hold. It moved through the room like a current, connecting every glance, every hesitation, every flicker of discomfort. Because the existence of the DNA results meant that this truth had been discoverable, and if it had been discoverable, then it raised the possibility that it had been discovered before. Electra's grip tightened around the envelope, her knuckles paling as the weight of that question settled onto her shoulders. She had not just revealed a secret. She had exposed a timeline, a sequence of events that demanded explanation. Her voice, when it finally came, was quieter now, but no less significant. She spoke of how she found out, of the tests, of the growing suspicion that had led her to seek answers, but even as she explained, it became clear that her knowledge was recent, that she had not been part of the silence for long, which meant someone else might have been. The room shifted again, the tension sharpening, narrowing, focusing, because secrets of this magnitude do not remain hidden without effort. And effort implies intention. RJ, now standing at the far end of the room, finally turned back, his expression no longer just shattered, but searching. There was pain there, undeniable and raw, but beneath it was something else beginning to form, something more focused, more deliberate. He needed to understand, not just what had happened, but how it had been allowed to happen. That need began to override the paralysis that had held him moments before. Electra saw the change, and it terrified her in a different way. Because grief could be shared, could be understood, but what she saw in RJ now was the beginning of something else. Distance, detachment, the first steps toward redefining himself in a way that might not include her at all. And she could not stop it, because she knew he had every right to feel that way. The emotional center of the room began to fracture further, dividing into smaller, more volatile exchanges. Some tried to comfort, others to confront, but no one could restore what had been lost. The sense of unity that had defined the evening was gone, replaced by a network of tension that connected everyone in ways that felt increasingly unstable. And beneath it all, something darker lingered. A sense that this had not simply been an unfortunate revelation, but a deliberate one. That realization did not come all at once. It emerged slowly, subtly, as the pieces began to align in ways that felt too precise to be coincidence. The timing, the setting, the fact that the truth had surfaced in the middle of a gathering designed to celebrate family. It was almost too perfect in its destruction. Ridge was the first to voice it, though even he did so cautiously, as if speaking the thought might give it more power. He questioned the timing, the circumstances, the way in which everything had unfolded. He did not accuse directly, but the implication was clear. This might have been orchestrated. That idea shifted the entire dynamic of the room. Because if this was not just a revelation, but a manipulation, then the situation extended far beyond personal tragedy. It became strategy. And strategy implies a player. Far away, in that same dimly lit space, the figure who had received the confirmation message earlier remained still, the faint glow of the phone screen now gone, replaced by darkness that felt almost intentional. There was no urgency in their movements, no need to check for updates, no concern about the outcome. Because the outcome had already been achieved. The fracture had been created. And now it would grow on its own. Back at the mansion, the emotional fallout continued to unfold, but now it carried a different undercurrent, one of suspicion, of awareness, of the unsettling possibility that they were not just victims of circumstance, but participants in something larger than themselves. RJ's gaze moved across the room, no longer just searching for answers, but for patterns, for inconsistencies, for anything that might explain how everything had unraveled so completely, so precisely. He was no longer just reacting. He was thinking. And that shift marked the beginning of something new. Electra, still rooted in place, could feel that change, could sense the distance widening in ways that words could not bridge. The love that had felt so real only moments ago had not disappeared, but it had been transformed into something else. Something complicated, something painful, something that could not survive in its current form. The family, once unified by shared history, now stood divided by it. And as the night that had begun with warmth and connection dissolved into uncertainty and fracture, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was not the end of the story. It was the beginning of a deeper unraveling. Because once a secret is exposed, it does not simply disappear. It echoes.
It spreads.
It demands to be understood. And in the search for that understanding, more truths are often uncovered. Truths that were never meant to be found. Truths that could destroy far more than what had already been lost. Somewhere, hidden in the shadows of that realization, the next move was already forming.